The witch you're picturing right now, the one in black, dancing under the moon, calling down power, she didn't exist until about 1954, and the people who actually practiced magic would have thought she was completely insane. Everything you think you know about witchcraft? It's younger than your grandmother's record collection. A British civil servant named Gerald Gardner essentially invented modern witchcraft whole cloth in the 1950s, stitching together bits of folklore, ceremonial magic, and what honestly feels like a lot of wishful thinking. He called it an ancient tradition passed down in secret. It wasn't. Here's the thing that'll really mess with you. The word, which was almost never an identity, it was an accusation. Something your neighbor screamed at you before dragging you to court. The people actually doing magic? They called themselves cunning folk. Wise women. Charmers. They were your local problem solvers, the ones you visited when the crops failed or your husband wandered or you needed to find a stolen ring. They didn't wear black. They didn't worship a goddess. They charged money, went to church on Sunday, and would have been absolutely baffled by everything we now call witchcraft. What we practice today, what we romanticize and reconstruct and argue about on the internet, it's a beautiful, powerful thing. But it's a 20th century creation built from fragments and folklore and an enormous amount of creative filling in the blanks. The aesthetic, the theology, the whole vibe, it's newer than rock and roll. And somehow that makes it even more interesting. Here's what actually happened when you needed a witch. You didn't go into the woods to find some mystical hermit communing with nature. You walked down the street to Margaret's house, because Margaret had a reputation. She found things. Lost wedding rings, stolen tools, a cow that wandered off 3 days ago. She knew which herbs stopped infections, which prayers pulled fever out of a child, how to break whatever your neighbor Susan put on your kitchen garden after that argument about the fence line. And she charged you for it. This was work. Cunning folk, that's what they called themselves, were service providers. The working class equivalent of doctors and lawyers, except they dealt in problems the official channels couldn't touch. Your bread won't rise, your husband won't look at you anymore, you're certain someone cursed your livestock. You paid Margaret, she did the thing, you went home. The magic itself? Completely, unapologetically Christian. They weren't worshipping pagan gods or summoning demons. They were reciting psalms backwards, writing Bible verses on scraps of paper and sewing them into sachets, invoking saints with the kind of casual authority that would have made priests nervous. Church rituals, reproposed. Everyone used them. Farmers, merchants, aristocrats when things got desperate enough. Because when the crops failed or the sickness wouldn't break, you didn't care about theology. You cared about results. And the cunning folk delivered. Here's the thing about the witch trials. They weren't hunting down some secret coven of practitioners. They were panic made flesh. Look at when the trials peaked. Plague years, wars, the Reformation tearing Europe apart. Communities were terrified, and terror needs a face. Someone to blame when the crops failed, when the baby died, when everything felt like it was falling apart. And who got blamed? Not the witches you're picturing. Mostly, it was poor women. Old women. Argumentative women. The village healer who'd had a falling out with someone influential. The widow who wouldn't remarry. Anyone who existed outside the narrow lines of acceptable behavior and had the audacity to piss off the wrong neighbor. That's it. That was the crime. The few who actually were doing folk magic, those village healers, the cunning folk, they often turned on each other to survive. They'd point fingers, name names, because this wasn't some organized resistance. There was no solidarity here. This was about staying alive one more day in a system designed to devour anyone it could reach. The trials were never about stopping real magical practice. They were about control, fear, and the grinding machinery of social order eating the vulnerable. Here's the thing they don't tell you: magic never actually went away. It just learned to be quiet. Folk magic survived the Inquisition, survived the trials, survived the entire machinery of persecution, because it was too boring to notice. It looked like your grandmother's remedy for fever. A farmer's almanac marking moon phases. Household superstitions that couldn't hurt might help. The books that survived weren't leather-bound grimoires hidden in crypts. They were practical manuals. Plant lore for healing. Astrology for knowing when to plant and when to harvest. Charms scribbled in the margins of family Bibles, passed down like recipes. Magic stayed alive by refusing to call itself magic. It was just what you did when the doctor was 3 towns over and your child had a fever. What you whispered over seeds when last year's crop failed. The little sachet of herbs you tucked into your husband's coat for protection, even though you'd never say why out loud. Cunning folk. Hedge witches. Root workers. They weren't performing elaborate rituals in the woods. They were the people you went to when nothing else worked. When you needed something and the church couldn't help you, or wouldn't. The real history of witchcraft isn't written in dramatic confessions extracted under torture. It's written in the back of cookbooks, in almanacs, in quiet knowledge that moved through kitchens and across garden fences. It survived because it was useful, because people needed it, because sometimes, honestly, it worked. By the Victorian era, something shifted. The witch trials had ended, the old agrarian world was vanishing into factory smoke, and suddenly, people missed magic. They craved it. So occultists in drawing rooms started inventing it wholesale. They mixed ceremonial magic with Eastern mysticism, threw in some theatrical robes and complicated rituals, and called it ancient wisdom. It wasn't. But it felt exotic, it felt powerful, and that was enough. Then came Margaret Murray in the 1920s, an anthropologist with a theory that changed everything. She claimed witches weren't scattered folk practitioners. They were an organized pre-Christian fertility religion, a secret cult that survived centuries of persecution. Her evidence was shaky at best, her methodology worse. Historians tore it apart. But here's the thing, it didn't matter. The idea was too seductive. An unbroken lineage of goddess-worshipping rebels? People wanted that to be true. Enter Gerald Gardner in the 1950s. He took Murray's mythology, added ritual nudity and a capital G goddess, starred in some ceremonial magic he'd picked up along the way, and sold it as Wicca, the old religion, finally revealed. He swore it was ancient, passed down through secret covens for centuries. It wasn't. But it resonated. Because what Gardner understood, maybe better than anyone, was this: we needed a mythology that felt old, even if we had to build it ourselves. Here's the thing you need to understand. You're not practicing ancient witchcraft. You can't be, because ancient witchcraft as a cohesive practice didn't exist. What you're practicing is a modern system built from historical fragments, court records, folklore scraps, medieval grimoires, Victorian occult revivals, all stitched together with intent and need. And that's not a weakness. That's actually the entire point. You're part of a living tradition that adapts, survives, and rebuilds itself from whatever's available. That's what makes it real. The Cunning folk didn't sit around worrying about whether their charms were pagan enough or their charms had proper lineage. They didn't need an unbroken tradition stretching back to some mythical golden age. They needed something that worked, and they made it work. They took what was around them, what they could remember, what they could steal from the priest's book or the traveling peddler, and they used it. Which is exactly what you're doing. The power isn't in the purity. It's in the doing. It's in the person who learns the thing, tries the thing, adapts the thing until it fits their life and their need. Somewhere right now, someone's whispering over a knot in a piece of string, or burying something at a crossroads, or lighting a candle with a very specific prayer. And they're not calling it witchcraft, they're just doing what needs doing, which is exactly how it's always worked. Follow Blackfire Atelier. I'll see you in the shadows.